I begin by giving the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, sir. Sir, if you believe it is a great pleasure for me to speak about the issue that we will talk about now, to make a statement on the side, then you are mistaken. But unfortunately, the situation is such that I will have to say a great deal today, and it will be incumbent upon you to listen to what I have to say. We are grateful to Mr. Demistur for his briefing, as well as to Mr. Markram. The Russian Federation called for this meeting to be held on the agenda item, threats to international peace and security. Insofar as we are deeply alarmed at the fact that in a number of capitals, above all in Washington, and those blindly following it, London and Paris, there was a deliberate policy undertaken to stoke international tensions. The leadership of the United States, of the United Kingdom, and of France, without any justifications and without considering the consequences, have engaged in a confrontational policy against Russia and Syria, and they are prompting others to follow suit. A broad arsenal of methods is being leveraged: slander, insults, hawkish rhetoric, blackmail, sanctions, and threats to use force against the sovereign state. Russia is being unpardonably threatened. The tone with which this is being done has gone beyond the threshold of what is acceptable, even during the Cold War. Such boorishness against my country is something which your predecessors did not take the liberty to undertake. What is next? We recall a rhetorical question which the Russian president put forward in 2015 from the United Nations General Assembly to our Western partners, above all the United States, concerning their reckless geopolitical experiments in the Middle East. Do you understand now what you have done? And the response at that time hung in the air. But there is a response. No, you do not understand. Just as you fail to understand what you are doing now. The lack of a clear strategy on any issue is appalling not just to us. It confounds not only us. This is confounding to the majority of those seated here. But they have decided not to openly put this forward to you. Following you everywhere you go, regardless of everything you touch, chaos is left behind, in the brackish waters of which you try to take out something. But only mutant fish are being taken out. I will put another rhetorical question forward. Do you understand the dangerous threshold towards which you are bringing the world? One of the areas where there's hostility that is most stark, that is on Syria. The terrorists and extremists supported by external sponsors are enduring a defeat there. Let us recall that we are talking about those terrorists and extremists who you supplied, financed, and deployed in the country to oust a legitimate government. And now it is clear why this is causing hysteria among those who invested political and material capital in these dark forces. Recently, thanks to the efforts undertaken by Russia, in line with the implementation of Security Council resolutions, a large-scale operation has been undertaken to lift the siege of eastern Ghouta. Its residents, for a number of years, were forced to endure the mockery and torture of fighters. More than 150,000 civilians were evacuated from that Damascus suburb, purely voluntarily, with the requisite security conditions being provided. Tens of thousands of them have already been able to return to the liberated areas, and many met with their relatives. There has been no change in the democratic composition, which is being shouted about by supporters of the Syrian opposition, has occurred. These are lies. With the leaders of armed groups, there were difficult negotiations that took place. As a result, many of them left the areas they had occupied with full respect for guarantees for their safety. Incidentally, during these transportation operations, several attempts were undertaken to stage terrorist attacks when the militants attempted to reach the buses with the Shahid belts. Others prefer to settle their status with the Syrian authorities. Thanks to presidential amnesty, they now will be able to return to civilian life, and subsequently, it is possible they may enter the Syrian security forces. We're talking about implementation of a UN principle, demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration. However, this positive dynamic is not to the liking of some. Foreign sponsors through Western countries were willing to take up any straw just to maintain a hotbed of terrorist resistance at a striking distance from the Syrian capital. This for the fighters to continue to terrorize ordinary civilians, to seize their food, and to request from the to beg of the international community that humanitarian assistance be delivered. Incidentally, they were not prepared to share medicine with ordinary civilians, as was shown in the inspection of the strongholds left behind by the fighters. As was the case in the past in eastern Aleppo, improvised hospital facilities in basements were full of medicine, which, as a result of sanctions, Western sanctions, were not provided to Damascus and other government-controlled areas. Also, large storage heights were found, as were the corpses of people who had been subjected to torture. We are stunned at the scale of the tunnels that were being used by jihadists, and some of them, small trucks were able to freely move about. These surprising underground facilities brought together the positions of groups who were viewed by some as moderate, and they were linked to the strongholds of Jabhat al-Nusra. On 6 April, the new head of Jaish al-Islam, following instructions of sponsors, derailed the evacuation of the fourth party of fighters from Douma and resumed the rocket and mortar firing against residential areas in Damascus. The firing targeted Mezze 86, Ish al-Vurur, Abu Rumana, and Umayyad. According to official information, 8 died, 37 civilians were wounded. Unfortunately, we failed to see statements from Western capitals condemning the shelling of a historical district of Damascus. The following day, 7 April, fighters accused the Syrian authorities of dropping barrel bombs with toxic substances. At the same time, the versions were being mixed up. It was either called sarin, times chlorine, or at times a mix of toxic gases. Based on a well-known scheme, these rumors were immediately taken up by those financed by Western capitals. I'm referring to NGOs and the white helmets who are mendaciously acting under the cloak of health professionals. And these reports were also taken up and transferred to media outlets. It behooves us once again to state that many of these dubious opposition structures have a clear list of the email addresses of representatives of Security Council members, which shows that some of our colleagues with a reckless approach towards their status are leaking sensitive information to their protégés. Incidentally, all should recall the way that accidentally the white helmets put on the internet a video which showed preparation for staging a so-called victim of an alleged attack perpetrated by the Syrian army. In 2011, the chemical serial began, and this continues to be shown to us with the calculation for each new episode to be more resonant than the one prior to it. In Washington, London, and Paris, immediately conclusions were drawn, pinning blame on the Syrian authorities, or, as they call it, the regime. Has nobody put the question to themselves, why does Damascus need this? There were insults against the Syrian government. However, the Syrian leadership. However, the main burden of responsibility was pinned on Russia and Iran, and I think that this is hardly surprising to anybody at this point. Now this has been done based on current trends immediately without any investigation being conducted. On 8 April, the Syrian troops sweeping through Al-Shimuna near Duma found a homemade manufacturing area of Jaish al-Islam to manufacture chemical substances artisanally. Chlorine agents of German manufacture and special equipment were also discovered. In Istanbul, the opposition journalist Asad Hamid, who is based, put on his Twitter page a video allegedly from the area of the incident. This has, probably from the white helmets, an unknown individual is next to a handmade bomb with a chemical which allegedly struck the bedroom of a building in Duma. All of this is accompanied by comments about another attack by the regime against civilians. The staged nature of this action is something of which there's no doubt. The trajectory of the alleged trajectory of the bombs is unnatural. This fell through a roof and naturally, calmly fell into a bed without damaging that bed. A wooden bed without damaging the wooden bed clearly was placed there prior to preparation for the staging. And there's an interesting coincidence. The chemical provocation in Duma on Saturday, 7 April, occurred immediately after the U.S. delegation at the Security Council received instructions to convene for today, Monday, 9 April, to convene expert-level consultations on their draft resolution on the mechanism to investigate incidents with chemical weapons. The initial text today has far-reaching changes and revisions. Under these obscure circumstances, of course, we need to get to the bottom of what is taking place. However, we need to do so in an honest, objection, impartial way, without disregarding the principle of presumption of innocence, and by no means prejudging the outcome of the investigation. Despite the provocations, the Russian specialists continued their efforts to resolve the situation in eastern Ghouta. In afternoon, 8 April, Sunday, following a new agreement that was reached, the evacuation of Jaish al-Islam fighters resumed. Following the liberation of Duma from fighters, a Russian of Jaish al-Islam fighters resumed. Following the liberation of Duma from fighters, Russian specialists were sent there, specialists on radiological, chemical, and biological protection, to collect evidence and information. They took soil samples, which showed the lack of nerve agent and chlorine-containing substances. Locals were interviewed about the cessation of resistance to the fighters. Not a single local resident confirmed the chemical attack having taken place. A local hospital, there were no reports about symptoms from a toxic substance such as chlorine. Other medical facilities are not located in Duma. The bodies of the dead as a result of contamination were not found. medical personnel and residents have no information about their potential burial areas. Thereby, the use of sarin and chlorine is not confirmed. Incidentally, the representatives of the Syrian Red Crescent refuted the statement allegedly made on their behalf on the delivery of assistance to victims of toxic gas. I call upon those who will speak against me slandering the regime to proceed from the premise that there was no chemical weapons attack. Sweden drew up a draft resolution to investigate the incident. In principle, in order to conduct an investigation, OPCW needs no resolution. However, we are willing to consider this resolution. Today, we propose that what you envisage in your project, in your draft, be done. Let the OPCW, which through the the Director General of the Technical Secretariat, Mr. Zumduk, stated a willingness to get to the bottom of what took place, let it immediately, tomorrow, fly to Damascus. There, the Syrian authorities and Russian troops will provide conditions to travel to the area of the alleged incident for them to familiarize themselves with the situation. Incidentally, this is what President Trump and other Western leaders called upon us to undertake. As for the possibility of a chemical attack being a possibility, this was repeatedly warned about by the Syrians at the Russian Center for the Reconciliation of Opposing Sides. It was stated that in order to take a film of a chemical attack, and I put this in quotes, the necessary equipment has already been brought in. We, too, made the relevant statements of the Security Council. You've heard these warnings. You've heard, but deliberately ignore them insofar as they do not align with the doctrinal views of those who sleep with and see in the elimination of a legitimate government in another Arab country. Still, what is not being looked into is the fact that a significant number of chemical weapons were discovered November-December 2017 in Syrian territory that had been liberated from fighters. At terrorist storage sites in Zaharia and Al-Wafir in Hama province, 21-ton containers were discovered. More than 50 munitions were found which contained toxic chemicals. In Tel Adli, Idlib province, 24 tons of toxic chemicals were discovered, and this is believed to be chlorine. At the storage site in Madamia, 30 kilometers northeast of Damascus, 240 and 160 millimeter caliber munitions were found. Plastic canisters were found with phosphorus substances and compounds. In the area of Al-Sarita, Idlib province, an industrial complex was found for the synthesis of various toxic substances. 54 chemical munitions were found, with 44 chemical containers were found, and these could be used for the manufacture of toxic substances. From the beginning of this year alone, 4 instances were reported of fighters using toxic chemicals against positions where government troops are located in Suja and El Mshaif. More than 100 Syrian troops were hospitalized. 3 March, when Hazrama and Afris were liberated in eastern Ghouta, fighters from government troops discovered in a tunnel an underground artisanal manufacturing site to make chemical munitions of a handmade nature. And this is far from a full list. It points to the wrongdoings and abuses by the irreconcilable opposition. However, the OPCW's experts being sent there to identify evidence is not something which we see people eager to do. We demand that OPCW verify all of those areas. Access can be provided. Also, information is surfacing that at Tanf, the camp, American instructors trained a number of groups of fighters to stage provocations with chemical weapons used to create a pretext for a strike. It was clear to us that the attempt to shelter terrorists and at the same time to punish the regime so hated by some Western capitals will sooner or later be undertaken. Speaking heads on television screens sought to repeat last year's attack against Syria. Last year's strike, this morning, there were strikes, missile strikes, against the Tifror airfield in Homs province. We are deeply troubled by such actions. Provocations in Duma echo last year's incident in Han Shihun. The unifying moment aspect is the fact that there's a planned nature of these attacks. Analysis of the U.S.'s operations prior to and after the incident in Han Shihun in April 2007 shows that Washington, ahead of time, prepared for its operation. The U.S. Porter and Ross naval destroyers from 4 to 7 April last year, that is when the toxic substance was used in Han Shihun before the strike against the Sharat airbase, were already present in the Mediterranean waters where they were engaged in planned operations. They did not enter the ports where an exchange of munitions could have been taken place by increasing the number of cruise missiles. Inter alia, 4 to 5 April, the Porter and destroyer was located southeast of Sicily, and the Ross naval destroyer was in passage from the Rota naval base in the area more south of Sardinia. Later, 6 April, an expedited movement of both naval destroyers was reported in the firing positions more southwest of Cyprus. From there, on 7 April, they conducted a mass strike against the Sharat airfield. At the same time, the number of Tomahawk missiles that were launched, 59 units, surpassed the overall munitions for 2 naval destroyers if they had actually been engaged in the anti-missile defense operations that had been assigned to them, and for that purpose, only 48 units were necessary. Thereby, U.S. naval vessels, even prior to the chemical incident in Han Shihun, entered military service with fit-for-strike equipment that is with an increase of cruise missiles that were necessary for the anti-missile defense, and this could attest to prior planning by Washington of a strike against Damascus. The fake news on Saturday from Duma are geared inter alia towards drawing attention of society away from the Skripal case, which was muddled up by London, and pulling and throwing on Russia completely unconfirmed accusations, and with the aim of pulling solidarity to build an anti-Russian alliance. Now, the English are stepping away from a transparent investigation and putting forward specific responses for the questions put, and at the same time, they are sweeping up their tracks. During the Security Council meeting 5 April on the Skripal case, we cautioned that an attempt to unjustifiably place blame on us of having had a hand in the Salisbury incident was linked to the Syrian chemical dossier. Yesterday, this issue saw new interesting developments. For the moment, the UK Foreign Minister Boris Johnson continues to disclose the things against Russia and attempt to be witty, and here is the following pearl. Experts of British naval experts south of Cyprus intercepted on the day of Skripal's poisoning. Intercepted reports from Damascus suburbs to Moscow, and this is what Times is reporting. It contains the following sentence. The phrase, "the message has been delivered." The parcel has been delivered, and 2 individuals successfully left. This turns out to be part of the intelligence information provided by London to allies prior to the expulsion of Russian diplomats. However, is it not clear that there's an irrefutable link here? Is that not clear to all? Syria, Russia, Salisbury. I would hint to the British intelligence services, and I will do so without charge. Another powerful course, a step. Why not propose that Novichok, which is so liked now, was reached Salisbury directly from Syria by parcel to cover up their tracks? This is complete mockery here. Ambassador Haley recently stated that Russia will never be a friend of the United States. And I wish to respond to that. Friendship is something which is both reciprocal and voluntary. One cannot force a friendship. And we are not particularly keen to be friends with you. We are not begging to be friends with you. Well, what we want from you is really nothing. It's something that is normal, civilized relations, which you arrogantly refuse, disregarding elementary courtesy, basic courtesies. And you're misguided if you think that you have friends. You have so-called friends of yours are only those who cannot say no to you. And this is the sole criterion for friendship in your understanding. Russia has friends. And unlike yourselves, we do not have adversaries. We do not view the world through that prism. And yes, international terrorism, that is our enemy. However, we continue to propose cooperation. This needs to be respectful and mutual cooperation. It needs to be geared towards resolving real, not imagined problems. And you should be equally interested as we are in such cooperation. Ultimately, as permanent members of the Security Council, we bear the main responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Based through the relevant channels, we already conveyed to the U.S. that armed force under mendacious pretext against Syria, where at the request of the legitimate government of the country, Russian troops have been deployed, could lead to grave repercussions. We call upon Western politicians to scale down their hawkish rhetoric, to meaningfully consider possible repercussions, and to cease the reckless spillover of threats to global security. What military misadventures of the West bring about are well known to us if we consider the examples of Yugoslavia, Iraq, and Libya. And nobody has vested you with the power to act as gendarmes, as policemen of the world, and at the same time to act both as investigators, procurators, judges, and executioners. We call for you return to the legal fold, to comply with the UN Charter, and to jointly tackle problems that arise, rather than attempting at each step to advance your egotistical geopolitical games. All of the energy needs to be focused on support for the political process in Syria, to which end it is necessary to constructively pool the efforts of all influential players. Russia always stands ready to engage in such cooperation. To conclude, Mr. President, I wish to take this opportunity to request an open briefing of the Security Council on the outcomes of the UN assessment mission in Raqqa and the situation in the Raqban camp. As we see the way members of the Commission attempting to create a smoke screen on this issue, which is a result of their actions in Syria, including the operation to raise Raqqa to the ground through the bombings. No chemical provocations will detract attention from what you have done. Thank you.
I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. de Mistura, and thank you, Mr. Markram, for your briefings. Almost exactly 1 year ago, I stood on the floor of the Security Council and held up pictures of dead Syrian children. After that day, I prayed that I would never have to do that again. I could. There are many truly gruesome pictures. Many of us have worked hard to ensure that one day we would not have to see images of babies gassed to death in Syria. But the day we prayed would never come has come again. Chemical weapons have once again been used on Syrian men, women, and children. And once again, the Security Council is meeting in response. This time, I'm not going to hold up pictures of victims. I could. There are many, and they are gruesome. Worse are the videos imprinted in our minds that no one should ever have to see. I could hold up pictures of babies lying dead next to their mothers, brothers and sisters, toddlers and infants still in diapers, all lying together, dead. Their skin is the ashen blue that is now tragically familiar from chemical weapon scenes. Their eyes are open and lifeless, white foam bubbles from their mouths and noses. Pictures of dead Syrians who are not soldiers, people who are not armed, people who are the very definition of innocent and non-threatening, women and children hiding in basements from a renewed assault by Bashar al-Assad, families that were hiding underground to escape Assad's conventional bombs and artillery. But the basements that Syrian families thought would shelter them from conventional bombs were the worst place to be when chemical weapons fell from the sky. And Saturday evening, the basements of Douma became their tombs. It's impossible to know for certain how many have died because of access to Douma is cut off by Assad's forces. But dozens are dead that we know of, and hundreds are wounded. I could hold up pictures of survivors, children with burning eyes, choking for breath. I could hold up pictures of first responders washing the chemicals off of the victims, putting respirators on the children. First responders walking through room after room of families lying motionless with babies still in the arms of their mothers and fathers. I could show pictures of a hospital attacked by the chemical weapons. I could show pictures of hospitals struck by barrel bombs following the chemical attack. Ambulances and rescue vehicles have been repeatedly attacked, maximizing the number of dead civilians. Civil defense centers have been attacked in order to paralyze the medical response, to increase the suffering of the survivors. Who does this? Only a monster does this. Only a monster targets civilians and then ensures that there are no ambulances to transfer the wounded, no hospitals to save their lives, no doctors or medicine to ease their pain. I could hold up pictures of all of this killing and suffering for the council to see. But what would be the point? The monster who is responsible for these attacks has no conscience, not even to be shocked by pictures of dead children. The Russian regime, whose hands are all covered in the blood of Syrian children, cannot be ashamed by pictures of its victims. We've tried that before. We must not overlook Russia and Iran's roles in enabling the Assad regime's murderous destruction. Russia and Iran have military advisors at Assad's airfields and operation centers. Russian officials are on the ground helping direct the regime's Starve and Surrender campaign, and Iranian allied forces do much of the dirty work. When the Syrian military pummels civilians, they rely on the military hardware given by Russia. Russia could stop this senseless slaughter if it wanted, but it stands with the Assad regime and supports without any hesitation. What's the point of trying to shame such people? After all, no civilized government would have anything to do with Assad's murderous regime. Pictures of dead children mean little to governments like Russia, who expend their own resources to prop up Assad. And this council, which saw these pictures last year, has failed to act because Russia has stood in its way every single time. For a year, we've allowed Russia to hold the lives of innocent Syrians hostage to its alliance with the Assad regime. This allowed Russia to also weaken the credibility of the United Nations. We are quick to condemn chemical weapons in the Security Council, but then Russia prevents any action, vetoing 5 resolutions on this issue alone, 11 vetoes altogether to save Assad. And our lives go on as usual. The Council created the Joint Investigative Mechanism. It found the Syrian regime responsible for the attack at Khan Sheikhoun a year ago. Because Russia supported Assad and his actions, Russia killed the mechanism. We condemned it, and our lives went on as usual. We pushed for a ceasefire. The Council unanimously agreed, but it was immediately ignored by Russia and Assad. We condemned it, and our lives went on as usual. And now, here we are, confronted with the consequences of giving Russia a pass in the name of unity. A unity that Russia has shown many times before they don't want. Here we are in a world where chemical weapons use is becoming normalized. From an Indonesian airport to an English village to the homes and hospitals of Syria. Since the Assad regime used chemical weapons at Khan Sheikhoun 1 year ago, chemical weapons have been reportedly used dozens of times. And this council does nothing. What we are dealing with today is not about a spat between the United States and Russia. This is about the inhumane use of chemical agents on innocent civilians. Each and every one of the nations in this council are on record opposing the use of chemical weapons. There can be no more rationalizations for our failure to act. We have already introduced and circulated to the Council a resolution demanding unrestricted humanitarian access to the people of Douma. Assad is doing all he can to assure maximum suffering in Douma. Our priority must be to help the starving, the sick, and the injured that have been left behind. We also call on this Council to immediately reestablish a truly professional and impartial mechanism for chemical weapons attacks in Syria, including the attack this weekend. We hope our colleagues on this Council will join us, as they have before. This is the very minimum we can do in response to the attack we just witnessed. Russia's obstructionism will not continue to hold us hostage when we are confronted with an attack like this one. The United States is determined to see the monster who dropped chemical weapons on the Syrian people held to account. You have heard what the President of the United States has said about this. Meetings are ongoing. Important decisions are being weighed even as we speak. We are on the edge of a dangerous precipice. The great evil of chemical weapons use that once unified the world in opposition is on the verge of becoming the new normal. The international community must not let this happen. We are beyond showing pictures of dead babies. We are beyond appeals to conscience. We have reached the moment when the world must see justice done. History will record this as the moment when the Security Council either discharged its duty or demonstrated its utter and complete failure to protect the people of Syria. Either way, the United States will respond. Thank you.
Of the United Kingdom for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. The American representative
said that Russia spends resources to support what she called the Syrian regime. My question to her: what about the United States? The United States is spending its resources in Syria on what? To provide food and milk to Syrian children, or to provide armed groups with weapons, armed groups that have committed the most heinous crimes against the Syrian people? Or is it spending resources on your planes and fighter jets that have been so active in Syria? My American colleague has been threatening my country in most Security Council sessions. Does she acknowledge then that her administration does not give this Security Council any weight? It does not respect the principles of international law or the United Nations as a whole? Let's test the credibility of what she presented. And note that I'm not referring to the American administration as the American regime, because it's shameful. We cannot do this in the United Nations. So, let's test the credibility of what she's presented. She said this Security Council must act to achieve justice in Syria. Okay then. My test is her administration should allow the disclosure of the results of the UNSCOM. They investigated the presence of WMDs in Iraq for 18 years. This commission was headed by a Swede, Hans Blix. And as you know, this commission didn't find anything after 18 years of investigation or examination. They didn't find any chemical weapons. They didn't find Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola. Nevertheless, in 2008, towards the end of 2008, the Security Council, in a closed meeting, decided to end the work of this commission and bury the archives of this commission in iron boxes. And only the Secretary General knows how to open these boxes. He's the only one who has the locks. There was one condition. These boxes can only be opened after 60 years. What is so shameful in this archives? Why did we need to bury them in boxes that cannot be opened in 60 years? Mr. President, the government of the Syrian Arab Republic condemns in the strongest terms the ruthless Israeli aggression that took place this morning on T4 airport in Homs Governorate, killing and injuring a number of civilians. This aggression is a flagrant violation of Security Council Resolution 350 of 1974 and Security Council resolutions on counterterrorism. This aggression would not have occurred were it not for the unlimited and consistent support by the American administration to Israel. The American administration guarantees immunity so that Israel is not held accountable. This allows Israel to continue to practice state terrorism and threaten peace and security in the region and in the world. Of course, Western countries did not refer even to the Israeli aggression in their statements. That means that they are complicit and they support this aggression. Unfortunately, my dear friend de Mistura did not listen to Netanyahu saying this morning that it is Israel that launched this aggression. This is why I was surprised when he said that the United Nations is not able to verify the identity of the perpetrators of this aggression. Well, Netanyahu himself, Mr. Mistura, is saying that he launched this aggression. Why didn't you refer to Israel? Why didn't you explicitly say Israel is to blame for this aggression? This Israeli aggression is an indirect response to the successes of the Syrian Arab army. The army succeeded in expelling armed terrorist groups from the suburbs of Damascus, rural Damascus, and other Syrian territory. Those groups have been shelling the Syrian people, kidnapping civilians, detaining them, using them as human shields. Damascus alone was targeted by 3,000 missiles within 3 months, killing 155 and injuring 865 civilians, most of them women and children. The Syrian government stresses that the repeated Israeli aggressions did not and will not protect Israeli agents from terrorist groups. They also will not and did not divert the attention of the Syrian Arab army from the decisive military victory over terrorists. Mr. President, the American anti-racism activist Martin Luther King said, and I quote, "A lie is like a snowball. The further you roll it, the bigger it becomes." End of quote. It seems that this wise saying holds true at any time and at any place. The governments of some countries are lying incessantly. Fortunately, though, they're not quite perfecting the details of their web of lies. Just as the famous character of Baron Münchhausen in German literature. Mr. President, some permanent members have become professional liars, and this in itself is a weapon of mass destruction. Through lying, Israel was occupied. Through Palestine was occupied. Through lying, they fueled the war in the Korean Peninsula. Through lying, they invaded Vietnam. Through lying, they invaded Grenada. Through lying, they occupied Iraq. Through lying, they destroyed Libya. Through lying, they established Takfiri terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda, Taliban, ISIS, Al-Nusra Front, Jaish al-Islam, and the list goes on. And through lying, these countries are trying to defeat Syria and prepare the ground for an aggression. It is worthy to note that the statement, the negative statement of the U.S. representative is in contradiction with a statement made by General Matthews, Defense Secretary. He said in an interview with Newsweek 2 days ago with the journalist Ian Winke,
هذا الصحفي وضع عنوانا للمقابلة مع وزير الدفاع الأمريكي ماتيس.
This journalist used a title for this interview. I will read it out in English.
Now, Mattis admits there was no evidence President Assad used poison gas on his own people. هذا ليس وزير دفاع سوريا.
This is not the Syrian defense minister, it's the American defense secretary. How coherent is this administration? Mr. President, on the 10th of December 2012, 2012, so 6 years ago, we conveyed a formal letter to the Council with the symbol A/67/628. So before the first time the operators of terrorist groups claimed that sarin gas was used in Khan al-Asal on March 19, 2013. We informed you that the United States, the United Kingdom, and France have launched a campaign of allegations claiming that the Syrian government might have used chemical weapons. Back then, we warned that such allegations would encourage governments that sponsor terrorism to provide chemical weapons to armed terrorist groups, and then claim that the Syrian government had used those weapons. What happened in the past few years in Khan al-Asal, Al-Ghouta, Kafr Zeta, Latamina, Talminnis, and Khan Shaykhun, and other villages and towns in Syria confirms unequivocally that we had what we had warned of 5 years ago. The United States, the United Kingdom, and France have been so eager to hold one meeting after the other, based on fabricated information. This is part of a deep crisis that we're witnessing, and they want to involve other council members in this crisis. These three countries created in the Security Council since 2013 a big elephant of lies and deceit, and this elephant is living today in this chamber and is stamping with its huge feet on the credibility of this council. It seems that these countries called for holding this session to support terrorists and to obstruct the agreement reached about Duma. However, these countries were a bit late because the terrorists wanted this meeting to be held before they were forced to reach an agreement with the Syrian state to leave their strongholds and hand over their weapons. These countries were late in fulfilling their promises to the terrorists. It would have been better not to repeat this broken record and not to rely on false reports from mercenaries, so-called white helmets, that were established by British intelligence officer James Lomizere. He's British, but his name is French. What proves that these countries were lying is that the residents of Duma left the city safely. 170,000 civilians left the city safely. Those terrorists chose to reach an agreement with the Syrian state as the last resort for them and their families. Buses are transferring them and their families to the city of Jarablus after they refused to settle their affairs and chose to go to the city of Jarablus. The vast majority of residents chose to stay where they were and to be on the side of the Syrian state. It turns out that allegations of some states, some of the members of this council, on the deteriorating humanitarian situation in eastern Ghouta were lies, just as what we witnessed in Aleppo. As it turned out, that warehouses of terrorist groups were full of medication and food, monopolized by some elements who sold these items to civilians at exorbitant prices. At this point, I have to ask, ladies and gentlemen, did the three countries call to hold this meeting to legitimize the Israeli aggression that occurred this morning, or to impede and obstruct the implementation of the agreement? In this context, I must thank the representative of the Russian Federation that recognized the true nature of what these countries were preparing for. So he called to hold a meeting under the agenda item Threats to International Peace and Security. This is the correct title. Mr. President, we conveyed to the Security Council, the OPCW, and what used to be called the Joint Investigative Mechanism, 145 letters, the latest on April 1st, 2018. 145 letters. And I thank the permanent representative of Kazakhstan, who noted that you don't read those letters and you don't respond to those letters. Those letters contain accurate information stating that terrorist groups, armed terrorist groups, possess toxic chemical substances, notably chlorine and sarin. We warned time and again that those groups are preparing for crimes of use of chemical weapons, and they're working with the white helmets to fabricate evidence, to take pictures of locations and film Hollywood-like scenes, everything staged, all that to blame the Syrian government, to influence public opinion, and to incite against Syria and its allies. This is why these countries called for holding this meeting to create pretexts and justify any military aggression on Syria. It seems, Mr. President, that the directors of this bloody terrorist scene failed to perfect their web of lies. We note that in each of those theatrical scenes on the alleged use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government, we note that these substances never find their way to armed elements. It's always children and women. Chemical weapons that discriminate against armed elements, but they love children and women. These substances only need to be washed away with water in front of the camera. Just water, Water heals everything. Rescue workers never need to wear protective masks. And it seems that the Syrian Arab army only uses those substances that it doesn't possess to begin with, because the Americans destroyed them on the Ray ship in the Mediterranean. So the Syrian Arab army only uses those substances that it doesn't possess in the first place, only when it is making military progress. How strange, how strange. Mr. President, this campaign lacks the minimum standards of credibility. It relies on fabricated information from social media. Armed elements have been fabricated in this information. I announce from this rostrum that Syria is prepared to facilitate a fact-finding mission from the OPCW to the place of incident in Douma as soon as possible to investigate and verify these allegations. We agree with the Russian proposal to listen to the fact-finding mission's report after it visited Raqqa. We welcome this visit as soon as possible. I hope this offer does not face the same fate as our first offer that we presented to the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon after the incident in 2013, in March 2013, in Khan al-Asal. Back then, we asked the Secretary General to provide assistance to the Syrian government so that we're able to investigate what happened in Khan al-Asal immediately. It took the UN 4 months and 11 days. As you recall, Dr. Syllström was sent to Syria. It took the UN 4 months and 11 days. That is how the UN interpreted the term immediately. 4 months and 11 days. And when Dr. Syllström arrived in Damascus to investigate what happened in Khan al-Asal, some groups claimed that chemical weapons were used in Ghouta. So Dr. Syllström moved from Khan al-Asal to Al-Ghouta. And just so you know, till now, no investigations have occurred into what happened in Khan al-Asal. Mr. President,
Today we directly accuse Washington, Paris, London, Riyadh, Al-Doha and Ankara of providing ISIS, Al-Nusra Front, Jais al-Islam, Failaq al-Rahman and dozens of affiliated terrorist groups with toxic chemical substances to be used against Syrian civilians. We accuse them of starting those massacres, of fabricating evidence to falsely blame the Syrian government of the use of toxic chemical substances to prepare the ground for an aggression against my country, just as the United States and the United Kingdom did in Iraq in 2003. Yes. We say to the United States and the United Kingdom and France that in Syria and Iraq we eliminated the vast majority of ISIS elements within 3 years, not within 30 years, as Mr. Obama has said, within 3 years and not within 30 years, as these countries had planned to justify undermining the stability of the region. Yes, we say to Saudi Arabia today that we eliminated its terrorist tentacles in eastern Ghouta, and I mean Jais al-Islam gangs. Yes, we say to Qatar and Turkey that we eliminated their terrorist tentacles in eastern Ghouta, and I mean Al-Nusra Front gangs and Failaq al-Rahman gangs. And I say to all those who exported to us armed, moderate, genetically modified opposition that we eliminated these toxic exports. And we call upon those exporters to bear the consequences of their actions, as some elements who survived would return to their original countries. It is very simple, really. Let me just say that on our borders with Turkey and in the separation zone with in Golan, we still have tens of thousands of good, moderate terrorists with their light weapons, long beards, black banners, and white helmets. Whoever wants to adopt them, please submit an application to their operators. They're ready. They're ready to be adopted. They can go to the West, they can go to Europe as refugees. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Syrian Arab Republic stresses once again that it does not possess any chemical weapons of any type, including chlorine, and we condemn once again the use of chemical weapons at any time and anywhere and under any circumstances. My country, Syria, stresses its unlimited cooperation with the OPCW to fulfill the commitments stated in the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, Stockpiling and Use of Chemical Weapons. The Russian Center for Reconciliation in Syria announced today that military experts have carried out investigations in Duma, and these investigations suggest that there are no signs of the use of chemical weapons there. And while treating the sick that are being treated in the hospitals of Duma, Russian doctors have proven that these patients have not been subjected to any chemical substance. So what we're witnessing here is really a Hollywood scene. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. This meeting stands adjourned.